Today's daf is Yevamos daf Yud Zayin, and we have 4 lines from the bottom of daf Tes Zayin Amud Beis, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Asi. Today's daf is being learned as a schus refuah shalema for Avadia ben Miriam Leah, Moshe Abba ben Devorah, Devorah bas Mecha, Shmuel ben Tehila, Elazar Lipa Shalom ben Feger Rachel, Sarah Nechama bas Rus Malka, Baruch ben Rachel, Yisachar ben Hinda Liba, Malka Miriam bas Esther, and Esther Kreindel bas Devorah. Today's daf is also being learned Le'ilu Nishmas, Mordechai Moshe ben Zelig, Le'ilu Nishmas, Reb Shmuel ben Ramosha, and Le'ilu Nishmas Shlomo ben Yibad L'chaim Tovim, Reb Chaim Dov. So we're at the very end of the first Perek of Masechtas Yevamos, the primary topic of which was the halacha that an erva and a tsaras erva and a tsaras erva that fall yibum are pater min hachalitza umin hayibum. Stating that the last several dafin were a little bit of a digression. Mishnah mentioned that whether in fact a tsaras erva is pater min hachalitza min hayibum was a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. It was Beis Hillel that was ironically machmer and held that a tsaras erva is asura, whereas Beis Shammai were matirin, they were matir tsaras erva. And from there, the Mishnah and the ensuing several dafim in the Gemara digressed a little bit to talk about this machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel related to the halach of tsaras erva, and then from there, additional machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Either way, the Gemara yesterday's daf mentioned that Rabbi Doisa ben Hurkina said that he had a Mesorah. Shal meducha zu yoshav Chagei Hanavi. The Chagei Hanavi sat on this mortar. The Amash Shloisha Dvarim. He said 3 things. Tsaras habas hasura. Tsaras erva is also like Beis Hillel. Amoin umoyav ma'asrin ma'aser ani b'shvius. The lands of Amoin umoyav, even though they had regular kedushas Eretz Yisrael during Bayis Rishon, but in this man of Bayis Sheni, not so much. There were no laws of Shvius that were noyeg and Amoin umoyav, stating that Chumas u'maisus were noyeg, so that the people living there gave Maiserani even during the Shemitah year. And finally, umekabum gerim mina karduim umina tarmudim. There seemed to have been some debate amongst the Chachamim whether the people living in Karduim and Tarmudim, who clearly didn't behave like Jews, were they in fact non-Jews, or maybe they were Jews that were born to a parent that wasn't Jewish, Evet v'kuti haba bas Yisrael havlan mamzer, which would have a chumrah then in terms of them ever becoming full-fledged Yidden, because although a non-Jew could be Megayer, and through Geirus he can become a Yid, but a Yisrael mamzer has no takana. He has no way of being able to enter the fold. Regardless, these were the 3 things that Rabbi Doisa ben Hurkina said he has a Mesorah in the name of Chagei Hanavi. He even knew where he was sitting when he said these halachas. So the Perek is going to end on a little bit of a digression, discussing the 3rd of the 3 things. The Rabbi Doisa ben Hurkina said in the name of Chagei Hanavi, and that is this concept of umekabim gerim and akarduim uminat tamudim. So we're going to discuss Talmud again in different places where there was some debate amongst the Chachamim whether the people living there were non-Jews, which would have been a good thing from the standpoint if they ever wanted to convert and be able to marry together with Yisraelim Ksherim, that's something they would have been able to do, or were they Yisraelim and as a result psulim, and as a result have no takana if they ever wanted to properly intermarry together with the Yid. It's the Gemara. The first Gemara is rather fascinating from a historical perspective. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Asi. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav Asi, if a non-Jew is Mekadesh Edisha nowadays, we're chayish that maybe he's married. Now this is a very big chiddush because a non-Jew does not have the ability to get married kedas Moshe Yisrael. So if a non-Jew goes over to a Jewish woman and gives her a ring, says Harei at mikudeshes li b'tabasu kedas Moshe Yisrael, the kedushin is not chal. Stating that, Rabbi Yehuda said, I heard from my Rebbe Rav Asi. He said that his man hazeh nowadays the halacha is different. That if an ovid kechavim would be mekadesh and yisho, we'd be chayish for the kedushin. And the reason is shema me'aseres hashvatim, because we're concerned that maybe this non-Jew is not really a non-Jew. Maybe he's a descendant of the aseres hashvatim. So what's the rest of the story? In the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, the Malchus of Klal Yisrael had been divided into 2 groups. There was the Malchus of the Aseres HaShvatim, and then there was the Malchus of the other 2 Shvatim, namely Shevet Yehuda and Shevet Binyamin. The 2 Shvatim lived in the southern part of Eretz Yisrael, what was known as Judea, and the other 10 Shvatim lived in the northern part of Eretz Yisrael, which was often referred to as the Galil. The division happened after the Petir of Shlomo HaMelech, Rechavim ben Shloimeh, he became the Melech in the southern part of Eretz Yisrael. Yeravim ben Nevat, he became the Melech in the northern part of Eretz Yisrael. But it would remain this way, where there would be two kings that were operating and functioning simultaneously in Eretz Yisrael. You had the Malchi Yehuda, they were in Shevet Yehuda Binyamin, the southern part of Eretz Yisrael. These were descendants of Shloimeh and descendants of David and Melech. And then you had what was known as the Malchi Yisrael, they were the northern part of Eretz Yisrael. Regardless, at some point, the king of Ashur came and he punished the Yidden that were living in the northern part of Eretz Yisrael. He took them into Galus. Now, he didn't take all of them, but he took the overwhelming majority of them. Where he took them into Galus, we don't know. And interestingly, today's daf is going to provide a clue. But before that, Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav Asi that the Rebbe Tained that if a guy would be Mekadosh and Yishuv Bizman Hazeh, you can't know for sure that he's a non-Jew. And you have to be concerned that maybe he's a Yid. And even though there's nothing about him that resembles a Yid, but maybe he's from the Aseres HaShvatim. And if he's from the Aseres HaShvatim, it's doch a Yid. And if he's a Yid, you have to be chayish for the Kedushin. This woman might be an Eish. And as a result, she cannot get married to a Jewish man unless she receives a get from this person, again, because of the concern that maybe the Mekadesh, although to us he appears like a non-Jew, is from the Aseres HaShvatim. So, faith the Gemara, an obvious question. V'hakol b'parish, meruba parish. Roiv oivnei kechavim are not from the Aseres HaShvatim. Let's assume that a percentage of them are, that assimilated, but the overwhelming majority, of course, are not descendants of the Jews that lived in Eretz Yisrael, in the northern part of Eretz Yisrael, at the time that these Aseres HaShvatim were taken into Galus. It's afraid the Gemara, you chayish for the Kedushin, why don't you say right? If it's a suffix, you don't know. Anytime there's a suffix, achi rabban lahatas. So why don't we say call the parish, meruba parish? So the Gemara says, beduchta dekvi. The only time Rav Asi said this halacha was if this Kedushin took place in a place where we know for sure the Aseres HaShvatim were taken into Galus. So if you're in a place where you know for sure the Aseres HaShvatim ended up, even though even there it's Yitachin that the Aseres HaShvatim are the miut, but al zen nemar, not for now, kol kavua kemechza al mechza dami, and for that reason you wouldn't be able to rely on the halacha of kol the parish meruba parish. Says the Gemara, was there in fact a place where they were taken into Galus? And do we know where that place is? The Gemara says, yeah. The pasuk says, and this is a pasuk in Amud Beis, Vayegel Melech Ashur es Yisrael Ashura. So the king of Ashur took the Yidden Vayegel, Miloshem Golos. He brought them into Ashur. Vayanchin, and where did he settle them? Bachlach uvechavar nahar goizon va'orei modeh. Says the Gemara, where were these places? Chalach zechi lozak v'chavar zu chadayav nahar goizon zu ginzak va'orei modeh zu Chamdon v'chavar yisrael. It's Chamdon and her suburbs. Some say zu near v'chavar yisrael. It's near and her suburbs. What are the suburbs of Nihar? Shmuel said, Krach, Mushchi, Chitki, V'Dumakya. So these names don't mean anything to us, but apparently, once upon a time, to the Amiram, they meant a lot. So the Amiram knew where the Aseres HaShvatim were taken into Galus. Afazoy Vayt, they actually said a halacha. The halacha was that an Ovid so we know that where the Aseres HaShvatim were taken into Galus is something that fascinated the imagination of people for thousands of years. This Gemara clearly provides a clue. There's Chazals in different places that talk about a river known as the Sambatyon, and the Chazal say that the Aseres HaShvatim were taken to the other side of the Sambatyon. And the problem with being on the wrong side of the Sambatyon is that it's impossible to cross because there's rocks and things that emerge from the river, which doesn't allow anyone to be able to come across. There is, however, one day a year, the Medrash says, that the Nar Sambatyon rests, and that's on Shabbos. But the problem is that Aseres HaShvatim, Chazal say, keep Shabbos. And because they keep Shabbos, they run into issues. And like this, they're not able to ever leave. But regardless, the Nar Sambatyon, that's something we're all familiar with. This is the Gemara right here, where the Gemara at least names different places where the Aseres HaShvatim was sent into Galus. So Rav Yochanan said, the Kulam Lipsol. Rav Yochanan said that even though we're saying that the Aseres HaShvatim went into Galus, into these places, but at the same time, we have to appreciate that if we would ever find the Aseres HaShvatim, they would be treated as being pasul. And the reason is because you have to assume they didn't keep the halachas. And if they didn't keep the halachas, they may have married chadi krisos, had children from chadi krisos. And if they did that, the children are going to be mamzerim. So at the end of the day, Rabbi Yochanan said that even if you know the places where the Aseres HaShvatim are, it's actually going to be more complicated for them to come and to, now become part of Klal Yisrael, because a non-Jew at the very least can be Megayer. But the problem is, being that there's a concern now that they're from the Aseres HaShvatim, so any place where the Aseres HaShvatim went to go, so you can't even be Mekabel Gerim, because there's a chashash now that they're not Goyim, they're actually Yidden. The problem is they might be Yisraelim Mamzerim. It's a chashash, but the bottom line is Kulam. So Rabbi Yochanan said at the end of the day, you won't be able to be Mekabel Gerim from Shmuel. And this halacha was said to Shmuel. So Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Asi, Shekidesh Bizman Hazeh, Choshushin L'Kedushin. Why Shem Aseres Hashvatim? Rabbi Yochanan added to that, but at the same time, Kulam L'Psol. Don't think that we assume that they're ksherim. We're assuming that they're possibly psulim, and as a result, you wouldn't be able to mikabel gerim. So when this halacha was set up with the Shmuel, so Shmuel said that I understand why you would assume that these people that were living in the city where the Aseres Hashvatim were taken into Galus would be considered Jews. What was his kasha? What do you mean? If you know that Aseres Hashvatim went into Galus, so you just track the lineage, there's a good chance that someone there is going to be a Yid. So he said like this, Bincha Bomina Yisraelis Kari Bincha. If a Jewish mother has a child from a non-Jewish father, the child is considered a Yid. But at the same time, if a non-Jewish mother has a child from a Jewish father, the child is going to be a non-Jew. So what was his kasha? So Shmuel's kasha was, it's even hard to explain the kasha because it's so obvious what the Gemara's response is going to be. But his kasha was, so what are you telling me? That you know where the Aseres Hashvatim went into Galus, and because you know where the Aseres Hashvatim went into Galus, so you're telling me now, all of a sudden, you have to be chayish, that maybe there's Yidden. Why are you being chayish there's Yidden? If the mothers are not Jewish, they're not Jewish. And for the Gemara, that's true. If the mothers are not Jewish, they're not Jewish. What about if the mothers were Jewish, right? Aseres Hashvatim, they had boys and girls. So the boys, if they would marry non-Jewish women, and the children would not be Jewish. But the girls, if they would marry even non-Jewish boys, then they would be Jewish. And certainly if the girls would marry Jewish boys, then certainly the kids would be Jewish. So how could Shmuel just deflect this whole Rav Asi by saying the kids are not Jewish? Why? Because the mother's not a Jew. But what if the mother is a Jew? You have all the Jewish girls from the Aseres Hashvatim. Their children would be Yidden. In fact, Ravina said, in case we needed a makar to this, that if someone has an anical through a non-Jew, but it's through his daughter, meaning the mother, the child is a Jew. It's just that the father is an Oived Kechavim, so Allah is Karibin, it's considered a Jewish child. So what did Shmuel mean? So the Gemara says, you want to know what Shmuel meant? It's Gemiri, the Binsa, Dahu Dar, it's Taruya, it's Tar. We have a Messiah that when the Aseres Hashvatim were taken into Galus, all the Bnei Yisrael, all the women suddenly were not able to have children anymore. And because they weren't able to have children anymore, so it's for that reason, Zok Shmuel, so Bal Karchach, if there's descendants from the Aseres Hashvatim, it's going to be from the men, it's not going to be from the women. If it's from the men and the women can't have children, obviously it's going to be from non-Jewish women. So non-Jewish women, the children are anyways not going to be Jewish. So this whole chash that maybe it's from the Aseres Hashvatim, said Shmuel was not a real chash. Some say that Shmuel, they told us over the Shmuel. Amud Beis, Shmuel said you don't have to worry about the Aseres Hashvatim. The reason is because we have a Messiah that they were all made into Oived Kechavim Gemurim. And it's based on a pasuk. The pasuk says, "B'Hashem bagadu kivonim zarim yoladu atu yoichlem chaydesh es chelkei." But either way, they were all turned into non-Jews. And if they were turned into non-Jews, so this whole idea that was not something you have to worry about. Why? Because they were turned into non-Jews. The bottom line is, it seems how we would treat the Aseres Hashvatim. This is a fascinating topic, not for today. Yosef was sitting behind Rav Kana. Yosef came to Rav Yehuda, and Rav Kana was sitting in front of Rav Yehuda. Yosef the Kamei said the following: when Talmud, the city of Talmud, is going to be destroyed, the Yidden are going to make a Yom Tov the Rabbanon. They're going to make a Yom Tov. Why? Because Talmud was a place where there were mamzerim. And because there were mamzerim that were living there, they caused problems. So the fact that there were mamzerim, they caused an issue. So says the Gemara that the day that Talmud is going to be destroyed is going to be a Yom Tov the Rabbanon. If Talmud was destroyed, what do you mean the day it's going to be destroyed? It was destroyed. So the Gemara says, Hachi Talmud Havai. There was a city Talmud and there was a city Talmud. Talmud was destroyed. Talmud wasn't destroyed. And that's what Amiram meant. They said, the day that Talmud is destroyed, it's going to be a Yom Tov. Rashi says, Hainu Talmud, Hainu Talmud. That means his Talmud and Talmud were the same city. So what does that mean? Why is it Talmud? Why is it Talmud? So what they would do is they would double up. If one side would have been destroyed, they would have settled on the other side. And if the other side, the city would have been destroyed, they would have settled. So the Kitzur, there was one city, Part of the city was called Tarmud. The other part of the city was called Talmud. Part of that city had been destroyed, but part of it was not destroyed. And when, let's say, the northern part of the city was destroyed, so they settled in the south. When the eastern part was destroyed, they settled in the west. But at the end of the day, all these Chevra from Talmud still live there. So the Rabbanan was saying that the day that it's finally going to be destroyed, it's going to be a Yomi Tavel Rabbanan. We're going to make a Yontif. The reason we're going to make a Yontif is because there's Mamzerim, then these Mamzerim cause problems. Yosef Rav Hamnuna was one sitting in front of Ula, and Rav Hamnuna asked the kasha to Ula. So the Gemara says, Amar, Ula commented about Rav Hamnuna. He asked him a good kasha. He was an Oikaharim. So he said, Ma Gavra. He says, wow, you're such a lambin. You're so gavaldik. And you could have been so much bigger, Ilav the Harpanya Mase, were not for the fact that you came from Harpanya. Sadly, regretfully, you come from a Shvache Shtat. And as a result, you never reached your potential. But what a gavra you would have been were it not for the fact that you came from Arpanya. So what was wrong with Arpanya? So the people of Arpanya, Rashi says, well, there too, there was questionable yichus. So he told them, if it were not for the fact that you came from Arpanya, you would have been worried. So the Gemara says, Ichsef. When he heard that, he was very embarrassed. Amalei. So he told him, tell me, Kesef Gugalta Lehecha Yavis. When you pay taxes, so to what locale do you pay taxes, right? Who do you pay your state income tax to, right? You pay to this state, you pay to some like the Funara. I pay. He says, oh, if you pay to the Funara and came to Funara, then you're not from Arpanya. Meaning you're a resident of the city that you pay taxes to. So if you pay taxes to Pum Nahara, you don't pay taxes to Arbanya, so then we're going to make you part of Pum Nahara. So he says, you're good, you could become a Gavra Rabba, you don't have to worry about the fact that you come from a shtat where people have lousy yichus, because at the end of the day, you're really not from Arbanya, you're really from Pum Nahara. Look at my Arpanya. Why was Arpanya called Arpanya? Rav Zeir said, because this was a city, this was a shtetl that all the psulim used to go to. So if someone was a mamzer, someone had questionable yichus, she was a mamzeres, right? That's where they all used to go. All the psulim used to the Rezach over there in Arpanya, and it actually got its name as Har Shakol Poinabim. As Lisa Tana, we went to the Braisno, Kol She'ein Makir Mishpachtoi V'Shiftoi Nifna L'Sha. That any person that didn't know what mishpacha he was from, what shevet he was from, right? He was a person, he Pasha didn't know his yichus. He had no idea from Vanet der Stam. So that's where he ended up. Arpanya was a place where they had the shvache yichus. Amar Rabba said, that Arpanya is deeper than Sha'ol. So what's Sha'ol? Sha'ol is one of the names of Gehenim. So how's it possible? Arpanya is worse than Gehenim? So Rashi says, the evil yard de Gehenim iktakanta. He says the people in Gehenim are going to have takana, like the Gemara says, Shenema. Miyad Sha'ol eftem, mimavas hagolim. One day this get but the ilu psul de do less takanta. But the psulim, the people that live in Arpanya, they're not going to have a takana because someone that is in Gehenim, at some point he'll get out of Gehenim. But someone that's a mamzer, he's less like takanta. He has no hope, and as a result, in a way, Arpanya, being a mamzer anyways is worse than being in Gehenna. So the Gemara, psuli de Harpanya mishum psuli de Mesha. The ikr psulim of Harpanya, they were originally in Mesha, they had resettled in Harpanya. Psuli de Mesha. The ikr, the primary psulim in Mesha, which psuli de Talmud, they had come from Talmud, of our Daf Spain. Psuli de Talmud, where did the psulim of Talmud come? Mishum abdei shloima. They came from these non-Jewish slaves of Shloima that we saw in yesterday's Daf. I know that interesting what people mean when they say there was apparently some expression that people would use. Kaba rabba v'kaba zuta. So a kav is a measurement. So a large measurement, a small measurement. Migander v'azal l'sha'il. It rolled into sha'il. Sha'il v'Talmud. From sha'il went to Talmud. Talmud v'meshan. Meshan l'Arpanya. So these were all cities where they were mamzerim. What's the punchline of what people used to say? They used to say that from Gehenim, when you roll down, when you travel south from Gehenim, you end up in Talmud and in Meshan and in Arpanya. Why? So Zok Rashi, it's based on what the Gemara just said earlier. Because as bad as Gehenim is, but at the same time, Gehenim yad sha'ol eftein. But someone that's a mamzer is ain't like takana. He has no hope, and because he has no hope, so therefore it's in a way actually worse off. And that was this expression that if somebody would roll out, go down from Gehenim, where would he end up? He would end up in these cities where there were mamzerin. And on that note, Hadron Aloch, Chamesh Esrei Noshim, Perek of Masechtas Yevamos, and Taka Gevaldig, we survived the first Perek, and Be'ezus Hashem, Lama Gein Weiter, and we're going to go from the first Perek straight into the second Perek, which is going to return very much to our regular program. Today's daf, from here until the end, is going to discuss primarily, we're going to start by tomorrow's daf. We're going to be learning from the most longish daf in the Perek, the Sugi of Zika, very, very geschmack. We have Daf Chaf coming up, which deals very much with the halachas of Chayvei Lavin and Chayvei Lavin Be'esin. the sugi of Shnius La'arayis, and this is going to segue us into Arba Achim. So either way, moving along as it relates to the Gishmaka Sugis here in Masechtas Yevamos. So the topic of the first Perek of the Masechta was really the first line of the Masechta. Chamesh Esrei Noshim, Poichois Tzareiseyem, Vitzareis Tzareiseyem, Min HaChalitza, Min HaYibum, Atzoif Oyim. And then the Mishnah listed the Chamesh Esrei Noshim. It listed the 15 arayas. One of the arayas mentioned was the Eishes Ach Shaloi Hoya Bailam. So we know a little bit at this point what the Eishes Ach Shaloi Hoya Bailam is. In the next few dafim, we'll know a lot of it in terms of what Eishes Ach Shaloi Hoya Bailam is. And really, our Mishnah begins with the question, Pasha, what's the textbook example of what an Eishes Ach Shaloi Hoya Bailam is? Zok the Mishnah, Shnei Achim, there were two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, Umeis Echad Mehem. And one of the brothers died. Reuven died. And then a third brother, Levi, was born. So Reuven dies. Eishes Reuven falls Leibim, the Shimon. Now Levi was born. Now there's suddenly another brother in the picture who's technically a potential Yavam. The Achakach, after Levi was born, Yibein Hasheni Eishes Achiv. Shimon did Yibum on Eishes Reuven. So again, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven died, leaves over a wife, no children. Shimon has a mitzvah to do Yibum. Before Shimon has an ability to do Yibum or to do Chalitza, Levi's born. After Levi's born, that's a critical piece, Shimon does Yibum on Eishes Reuven. Umeis, and then Shimon died, left over two wives. He left over Eishes Reuven that he had been Miyabe, and he also was married. So he left over his wife then, wasn't the Yavam. And now these two women fall the Yibum the Levi. The first woman that falls the Yibum the Levi is Eishes Reuven, who, by the way, had fallen to Yibum to Levi already. Levi was one that was born when Eishes Reuven was a Yevama before Shimon did Yibum, plus Shimon's wife that had never fallen to Yibum until now. So what's the halacha? Harishayna, the first wife, that's the Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam, that's Eishes Reuven. Yoitza Mishum Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam. She is not going to have any Yibum v'chalitza. What does it mean? She's Yoitza. She's free to get married. There's no Zika. There's no Shemeres Yavam. Why? Because she's the Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam. Vashniya. And the second wife, Mishum Tzarasa. She's the Tzara of the Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam. Talk to Mishnah Asabamai. What would happen if Shimon, after Reuven died, instead of doing Yibum, he would have done Maimer. So what's Maimer? Maimer is where the Yavam, instead of doing Bia, which is what Yibum is, he's Mekadesh her as if she was a regular Pnuya. So he would give her Kesef or Shtar and say, Hareh Mekudesh Asli. So Midday Rai, so we know it's nothing. We spoke about this in the introduction to the Masechta a few times since, because Midday writes it's Yavam or Yavam, it has to be Bia. However, the Rabbanan said that in the event that the Yavam does Maimer, at least on a rabbinical level, something should go into effect. So what would happen if Shimon, instead of doing Yibum, he did Maimer? And then Shimon dies, Umeis. So two women are falling the Yibum to Levi. The first woman that's falling to Yibum to Levi is Eishes Reuven, who's also a shtickle Eishes Shimon, because Shimon, although he didn't do Yibum, he did Maimer, which means she's the Yevama da'iraisa to Levi, mitzad Eishes Reuven, but oichet a Yevama d'Rabbanon to Levi, mitzad the Maimer of Shimon. Additionally, Shimon's wife also falls the Yibum. So here the Allah is Shniya Chayletzes Lemis Yevamos. Over here, the Shniya is not a Tzaras Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam that can just go free. However, Levi is going to be obligated to do Chalitza. And let's explain. He can't do Yibum because she's a Tzaras Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam. Why? Because she's falling the Yibum, that's obvious, but also the Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam is falling the Yibum. Being that Shimon did Maimer, so on some level, Eishes Reuven is also Eishes Shimon, which means there are two women that are falling the Yibum now. One Midrabanan, one Midairaisa. Midrabanan, she's an Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam. The one Midairaisa is a regular Yevama, but on a Rabbanan level, the regular Yevama is a Tzaras Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam. You can't do Yibum. But at the same time, you have to do Chalitza. Why? Again, Pashat, because the Eishes Ach Shloi Bailam is only falling the Yibum Midirabanan. She's not falling Liyibum Midairaisa, because Midairaisa, Shimon was never miyabim her. So now that Shimon died, really Shimon only has one wife, Midairaisa. If Midairaisa only has one wife, Midairaisa, this wife can't be a tzaras anything. If there's only one wife, she's not a tzara by definition. So for that reason, it's impossible for her to be a tzara Midairaisa, and therefore you can't just allow her to be Yaitza. She has to have something. So what's the halacha? The halacha is no Yibum because Midei Rabbanan, she's an Eishesach, she's a Tzaras Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai, but at the same time she needs Chalitza because Midei Raisa, she's not a Tzaras Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai. Either way, the Mishnah just gave us the example of what Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai is, which in short is, right, what's the short version of Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai? When Reuven died, Levi had not been born yet. And as a result, Eishes Reuven becomes an Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai. And really, if the Mishnah was going to give us the most simple definition of Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai, if we were learning this mamish for the first time, so somebody would say, Ketzad Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai, that's what we would say. Reuven was married, he had no children, he died, and then after he died, Shimon was born. You wouldn't even be talking about Levi. You'd say Shimon was born. Ordinarily, it'd be a mitzvah of Yibum, but over here there is no mitzvah of Yibum. Why? Because Eishes Reuven is an Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai. So why did the Mishnah get all fancy? Why is there Reuven and Shimon and Levi? And why are we talking about Maimer? The reason is Pashat. The reason is because this Mishnah is not just telling us what Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai is. It's really commenting on the first Mishnah of the Masechta. The first Mishnah of the Masechta didn't tell us the halacha of Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai. It said that in Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai is Poitras Tzaresein, but Tzaresein, so we're talking about a case where an Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai would pater a tzara. The only time the Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai is going to pater the tzara is if there's an afila shniya, and that's why the Mishnah is talking about where there's not just Reuven and Shimon, but there's also a Levi, and then there was an afila shniya. So that's Pashup Shan in the Mishnah. Why the Mishnah didn't just give us a very, very basic example? Because the Ketzad of the Mishnah is really referring back to the first Mishnah. And if you're not sure, just look at the first Rashi in the Perek. Ketzad Eishes Achiv Shloi B'Yomai. Zok the Heilige Rashi, Paiteres Tzarasa. Rashi understood the Mishnah's question was not what's an example of Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai, because if that was the question in the Mishnah would have given a much simpler example. It would have given a much more pashta case. The teretz is it's muchach from the teretz of the Mishnah what the kasha of the Mishnah is. It's obvious that the question was what's an example of an Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai that pat is the tzara. Oh, you want to know that? Oh, that example involves already an afila shniya. If it involves an afila shniya, we have to welcome Levi into the Mishnah, and that's why the Mishnah is getting involved in such a case. Just one other thing that's worth speaking out right now is that the Mishnah was very, very precise. Right? This is a good idea. This is something that we talked about before or after one of the Shiurim, and that is when you go through these cases, and we're going to start getting into the cases now, not stop. So when you go through the cases, a lot of different nuances. Ruba de Ruba of the times, every single nuance in the case is bedafka. I mean, there's a reason the Mishnah said it the way it said it. Every now and again, Rashi or Tosfos or one of the Rishonim will say that this is la dafka. But really, until proven otherwise, you assume that all the details and all the pratim that were mentioned in the Mishnah are mentioned for a reason. So, for example, the Mishnah said that the case of Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai, like Rashi says, that's Poiteres Tzarasa, is where there were two brothers. One of them died. Then the third brother was born. And then the second brother did Yibum, right? So it was Reuven and Shimon. Reuven died with no children. Levi was born. After Levi was born, then Shimon went and did Yibum. What would be if it was Reuven and Shimon, Reuven died, Shimon did Yibum, and then Levi was born. And then Shimon died and had another wife. It sounds like from the Mishnah, that would not necessarily be the same halacha as it is in our Mishnah. And the Emes says, we know this already from learning the first Perek. It's Machlokes Reb Shimon and the Chachamim, what the halacha of that case would be, and whether or not Eishes Reuven, who was already Eishes Shimon at the time that Levi was born, would be treated like an Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai. This was very much the topic of the intense Rashi and Daf Tes Amud Beis, but the Gemara mentioned Reb Shimon's Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai. It's the next Mishnah we're going to learn. It's going to be in tomorrow's Daf on Daf Yud Tes Amud Beis, but just the diktuk that what happened was Levi was born before Shimon did Yibum. That's why there's no Reb Shimon mentioned in the Mishnah. In the next Mishnah, the Mishnah is going to discuss what happens if it didn't happen in that order, but Shimon did Yibum before Levi was born. And there the Gemara is already going to get involved in the sheet of Reb Shimon and the sugya of Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai. Zok the Gemara. So again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said that Ketzad Eishesach Shloi B'Yomai. Rashi says that's Poiteres Tzarasa. So the case is there were two brothers. One of them died, left over no children, and then a third brother Levi was born. Then Shimon did Yibum. Shimon died, left over no children, and left over Eishes Reuven, who he had been Miyabeh, and another wife. So these two women now fall Yibum. So the Mishnah said, Harishoina, the first wife, Levi doesn't do Yibum on because she's the Eishes Shloi B'Yomai. She was Eishes Reuven, and Levi wasn't alive at the time that Reuven died. The Shniya, the second one, is also not going to do Yibum or Chalitzan because she's the Tzara, and that's the case of Eishes Shloi B'Yomai, the Patas the Tzara. But here's the point: the Rishoina is the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai. The Shniya is the Tzaras Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai. Amr Rav Nachman said, Man the Tani Rishon Eloi Mishtabish. Whoever has the Girsa in the Mishnah, the way we have it right now, that the Rishon is the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai, and the Shniya is the Tzaras Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai. Eloi Mishtabish is not making a mistake. He's right. Abu Man the Tani Shniya Eloi Mishtabish. And the one that had it Fakir, apparently there was another Girsa that Rav Nachman was aware of, where the Mishnah refers to the Shniya as being the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai, and the Rishon is the Tzar of the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai. And Rav Nachman said, he's also okay, and he explained. The one that says that the Rishon is the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai makes sense. Why my Rishon l'nefila? Right? Who would you think is the Rishona? The Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai. Why? Because she was Eishas Ruvei. She was the one that fell Yibum already back in the day. Now she's falling for the second time. This Sarah is falling now for the first time. She's the Rishona l'nefila. She fell once before, and as a result, she's considered a Rishona. The one that says Shniya l'mishtabish, it also makes sense. Why? Because my Shniya l'nesur. The reason the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai would be considered the Shniya is because she's the second one that Shimon married. The assumption for a moment is that Shimon was married when he was Miyabim Eishas Reuven. So the second woman that he married was the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai, and that's why the Mishnah maybe would refer to as the Shiur. How do you know Shimon married the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai second? Maybe first he married the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai, then he married the Tzara, then he died, right? That's not a detail that you would think matters either this way or that way. So why would you ever refer to the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai as the Shniya? Because you're making an assumption that is just a frivolous assumption. There's no reason to assume it. It has no impact on the halacha. So why would you assume that the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai was the second? Gemara says you're right. My Shniya, no. What Rav Nachman meant to say is that the rationale to refer to the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai as the Shniya is because she's the Shniya ben Asuin. She's getting married now for the second time. So she was the first one to fall the Yibum, the Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai, because she was Eishas Reuven, but she's also getting married now to Tzveitim Mol. In our Mishnah, in our case, she was married to Reuven, then she got married to Shimon, and now she fell the Yibum to Tzveitim Mol. But the point is that being that she had been married now for a second time, so that's why she would be called the Shniya. So either way, if you want to refer to Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai as the Rishona, makes a lot of sense. Loi Mishtabish, and if you want to refer to it as the Shniya, Oichet Loi Mishtabish. What is the makar in the Torah to Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai? I'm Rabbi Rabbi. Who does the name of Rabbi? Amakra, it's based on a pasuk. Which pasuk? The introductory pasuk to Yibum. It says Ki yeshvu achim yachtav, and we learn from the word yachtav shahoiselam yeshiva achas ba'ilam. It's referring to two brothers that live together at the same time. As opposed to Eishasach Shlahir Ba'ilamai, they weren't alive together. They didn't have yeshiva achas ba'ilam because by the time that Levi was born, right in our Mishnah, it's Reuven and Levi. So by the time Levi was born, Reuven wasn't alive anymore. Zok Gemara, okay. Yachtav. It says Yachtav. What does that mean? Miyuchadim menachla. They have to be miyuchadim lenachla. So let's see Rashi inside, because it's going to be the topic of the raid. Rashi says, there has to be two brothers that are roy to yarshin each other. Two brothers that are ru'uyin leirish zezeh. What does that mean? Prat la'ochiv min ha'em. As opposed to brothers that are brothers because they share a common mother. So if the brothers share a common father, then they're going to be considered brothers l'inyan yibum. But if they only share a common mother, they're not going to be. And how did the Torah tell us that? Because the Torah said yachtav, which means miyuchadim benachla. It means they yarshin each other. And when it comes to Dina Yerusha, paternal relatives are considered relatives, but maternal relatives are not considered relatives. So by the fact that it says Yachtav, it means Yerusha, and this is the makar to the most basic halacha in Yibum, and that is when it says Ki yesh v'achim Yachtav. What does it mean? It means that they're brothers mitzad ha'av, not necessarily mitzad ha'em. Now, if they're brothers mitzad ha'em, tavei aleim bracha. But it's neither here nor there. It's completely irrelevant. What matters is whether they're achim and ha'av. And how do you know that? Because it says in the Torah, Miyuchadim benachas. Rabbi said, achim and ha'av, yalef. The fact that when it says in Torah, Ki yesh v'achim, it means achim and ha'av, we learn from somewhere else. Not from Yachtav, means that they have to be royal leirish zeh. But rather we know from somewhere else. It's learned that achva achma b'nei Yaakov. It's learned that from Xer Shava, from the b'nei Yaakov. The pasuk says regarding the b'nei Yaakov, Ayomu shneim aser abodecha achim anachnu. Now we know the b'nei Yaakov, they were brothers because they shared the same father, Yaakov Avinu, but they didn't have all the same mother. So just like the brothers were achim and not from the mother. So too when it says achim ayibur, it means why don't we learn the Xer Shava achim to Arias? Where does it say Achim by Arayas? So it's by the Erv of Eshes Ach. Ervas Eshes Achicha Loy Segala. And over there, even an Eshes Ach Me Imoy is considered an Eshes Ach. It doesn't have to be Dafka Min Ha'av. In Arayas, it doesn't matter if it's Min Ha'av or Min Ha'en. By Yerusha, it matters. So how do you know to learn Yibum from Achim? Yaakov Avinu, maybe learn it from Arayas. So the Gemara says, Donim Achim Me Achim, Ve'ein Donim Achim Me Achicha. Achim and Achim, that's the same word that you can learn in Gzeir Shava. But to learn Achim, Ki Yesh Achim Yachtav, from Ervas Eshes Achicha, it's not the same word. It's the same Shirish, it means the same thing, but it's not the same word. That's not Gzeir Shava. Faith, might not be, a ton of Rabbi Shmuel, everyone knows that Rabbi Shmuel's yeshiva, they taught that it says V'shavakoy, and somewhere else it says Vahakoy. So yeshiva Zuibiyah, and because the words mean the same thing, so Rabbi Shmuel's yeshiva, they used to darshan Gzeir Shava from V'shavakoy to Vahakoy. So you see, you can darshan Gzeir Shava, even in the case of V'shav to Uba. Why? Because at the end of the day, the words mean the same thing. So the Gemara says true. I don't mean to say you can't learn Gzeir Shava ever between the word Achim and the word Achicha. What I mean is, meaning if you have a choice, I can learn the Gzeir Shava to here, I can learn the Gzeir Shava to there. So then you're supposed to pick the thing that's more comparable. If, however, there aren't two options, there's only one option, and that one option is not a perfect hit, that doesn't bother me. Achim and Achicha is okay. Even V'shavakoyin V'hakoyin is good. So again, when is it true that you could darshan V'shavakoyin V'hakoyin? And when is it true you would be able to darshan Achim and Achicha? That's if there's nothing that's more similar. But if there's something more similar, more comparable to darshan, as far as Gzeir Shava goes, it's better to learn it from the thing that's more comparable. How do you know to learn it from the Bnei Yaakov? It's true, the Bnei Yaakov were Achim Mina'ah, but maybe learn an Ach v'Achra from Loit. The Pasuk says that Loit was referring to Avram, and he said, Ki Anoshan Achim Anachnu. They weren't brothers. Avram Avinu was Loit's uncle. And you see that Apal Pike, he referred to him as Anoshan Achim. So you see that Achim doesn't necessarily mean brothers. So maybe there's a mitzvah Yibum even by an uncle. So the Gemara says, it makes sense to learn from Bnei Yaakov, Mishum de Mifne. Because the word Achim by the Bnei Yaakov is Mufna. Why? Really, what they could have said is Vayoimu Shneim Aser Avodecha Achim Anachnu. Bnei Ish Echad. Right, we have the same father and we're brothers. The word Achim is extra. All they had to say is that they have the same father. It wasn't necessary to say that they're brothers. If they have the same father, we know they're brothers. It's an extra word to teach me Gzeir Shava. What Gzeir Shava? To teach me Halacha in Yevamos. So in other words, we have two drushes really. How we know that when it says in the Torah, Achim Yachim, it means Achim and Oav, it doesn't mean Achim and Oav. The first drasha that we had was Rabbi Yehuda Marav, who learned it from the word Yachtav. Ki yeshvu Achim Yachtav. What does Achim Yachtav mean? Achim that yarshin each other. That's what Rashi says. These are brothers that yarshin each other. Rabbi said it's learned to Gzeir Shava from Achim Bnei Yaakov. Zok the Gemara, that even though it's a machlokes Amiron, really, what does it sound like? Two different pshatim. This is a pshat, and that's a pshat. Each pshat sounds like it has merit on its own. But the Gemara says that really, Lefio MS, it's Yagid Olav Reyoy. The two pshatim complement each other. And really, we need both pshatim. Because each pshat in and of itself is imperfect. But once you have the two pshatim together, then it's Gevaldik. Then it's a Makar. The Gemara explains. Itzrich l'michtav Achim, the Itzrich l'michtav Yachtav. We need Achim, which was Rabbi's drasha, and we need Yachtav, which was Rabbi Yehuda Rav's drasha. House. Because had it only said Achim, meaning had we only had the Rabbi's drasha, I mean, I would have thought Leilaf Achim Miloy. I would have said that, how do you know learn the Gzeir Shava Achim from Yaakov? Maybe learn the Gzeir Shava Achim from Loy. The Chitain, Loy Mifti, the Gemara already asked that question, where I answered it. What was the Gemara's terror? Achim by Bnei Yaakov is Mufna, but by Loy it's not Mufna. Where it says, no, La'ayah Fluye Mifni. By Loy it's also Mufna. Because Mida Havalei Lamichtav Reyan, Biksid Achim. It was a funny word that Loy used. Loy said, we're brothers. We're not brothers. We're Reyan. We're friends. We're Mishpucha. But we're not brothers. The word Achim doesn't seem like it's the right word. You know why he probably said the word Achim? Probably it should be Mufna. So the emes is that it looks like that just like the word by the Bnei Yaakov is extra, maybe to teach me Halach and Yevamos, maybe the word by Loit is also extra. That's what we have. The word Yuchad Benachla. We're talking about brothers. They yashin each other. And had it said Yaakov, I mean, I would have thought the Miyachti Ba'abu Be'ima. I would have thought that maybe it has to be brothers that have the same father and the same mother. Right, that's maybe what you would think Yachtav is. Tzricha. Therefore, the Torah also had to say Achim, the Gzeir Shava by the Bnei Yaakov, because there they had the same father, they didn't have the same mother. Why would you think that Yibum Achim means that they have the same father and the same mother? And the Gemara adds a knech. Yibum ben Nachla Tal Rachman. You find that Yibum, the Torah was Toila Nachla. So where do you see that? So Rashi says it's based on a Gemara that we're going to learn in a few days, where the Gemara says that when the Yavam used to be miyabim, the Eshes Hames, he used to yarsh and everything. So Yerusha Nachla is an important part, it's an integral component to the laws of Yibam. So being that Yibam is Menachem Tal Rachmanav, and Nachla Menav Loim Aim, and Nachla doesn't care about maternal yichus. All it cares about is Menav. So why would you ever have a Havamina that you have to be Achim and Avamina? And where's that Havamina coming from? Someone says, Itzrich, I'll tell you why. I would have thought, being that the whole concept of Yibam is a chiddush, right? You think it's the biggest chiddush in the world. The commissionary ergabe, because it's matter and erva. So maybe you would think that because of the chiddush, the only time there's Yibam is if they have the same father and the same mother. Tzrichas of the Gemara. That's why at the end of the day, what's the makar teishas achshel by lamai? Ki esh va'achim yachta, yeshiva achas ba'olam. Agavurchi. This same pasuk, these same words, are also the makar to the fact that when we talk about brothers in Yibam, what we mean is achim and av, as opposed to achim mino'im, and it doesn't even matter if they're not achim mino'av u'mino'im. The only thing that matters is they're achim mino'av, and the maskanas haGemara. How do we know that? We know it from a combination of two drashas. Number one, because it says ki yesh va'achim yachtav hamiyuchadim benachla. That's number one, and number two, it's based on Gzeira Shava from the Bnei Yaakov. So just a little bit of raid as it relates to the Gemara that we just learned, and really to some of the Gemaras that we learned a little bit recently. And this is some classic raid, some not such famous raid, in Beis Medrash for Chiddush, but again, just Yesoidis in terms of learning Yevamos, abyssal vimalentis in the Koisley Beis HaMedrash. And that is the Mordechai in the fourth Perek of Masechtas Yevamos, in Perek HaChoyletz. He brings that many of the Gaonim said a Gevaldige Chiddush. The Gaonim said that what happens if you have two brothers? One of them dies, he leaves over no children. However, the brother that died was a mummer. So for example, he was a meshumid. He left the Yiddish way completely. Maybe he converted out of being a Yid. Maybe he's a Mechal Shabbos Befarhesya. Maybe he's a mummer l'chol atayra kula. But he's a mummer. He's someone that halacha deems not to be treated like a Yid. If he would die and leave over no children, the Gaonim, as quoted by the Mordechai, said, the brother that's alive, Shimon, would not have a mitzvah to do Yibam. The same would be true in the event that Ruvain was an Upgeit to the Yid, and he died, left over no children, but he left over a Yevamo. Ruvain has a brother, but this brother is a Meshumid. He's a mummer. Say the Gaonim that Eishnis Ruvain would not fall a Yibam. What does that mean? She doesn't need chalitza if she wants to get married. There's no loisa saying the Torah of loisia eishes ames achutza leirsa. The question is why, and the Mordechai discusses it. And Toich Dvarav, the Mordechai quotes from Rishonim that the Rishonim said that the hezber in this shita that permeated the Gaonim is because we find the different areas in halacha that if it says in the Torah there's a requirement of achicha, of an ach, it means that it's a person that keeps Torah mitzvahs. So for example, it says in the Torah that you're not allowed to charge a yid ribbis. And when it says it, there's an issa ribbis, it says, don't take ribbis me'achicha. Don't take ribbis from your brother. And the Rishonim said, it's a Gemara, that if someone's a mummer, if someone's a meshumit, there's no issa to take ribbis. Why? Because he's not achicha. Because a yid is considered achicha. He's considered a brother when he behaves like a brother. But if he doesn't behave like a brother, he loses his schus of being considered a brother. So when it says in the Torah, don't take ribbis from your brother, it means you're behaving like a brother. But if you're a meshumid, even though your mother's Jewish and your father's Jewish, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you're lad achicha, and as a result, you're not going to have a din of a yid. So zok the Mordechai. You want to know pshan in this shita saga? That's the pshan. What's the makar to the mitzvah of Yibum? It says, Ki yeshvu achim yachta. Brothers, once we find that in halacha, someone that's a mummer is not considered achicha, he's not considered a brother. So based on that, says the Mordechai, a mummer will be mufka from Yibum. And it doesn't matter which side of the equation the mummer's on. Because Ki yeshvu achim is describing Ruvain and Shimon. It's describing the brother that died, and it's describing the Yavam, the brother that has a mitzvah to do Yibum. But if either one of them is going to be a mummer, so now you're not going to have the mitzvah of Yibum. Why? Because he's not mechlal ochicha, kimavur in hilchas ribis, and kimavur b'shar mekaymes in halach. As they state in Mordechai in Perek HaChoyletz. The emphasis, if you think about this Mordechai for 1 second, this might be the schwerste Mordechai in history. It's a pella. It has no pshat. It's impossible to even read. Why? What's the pella? When it says in the Torah, you shouldn't charge ribbis from your brother, what does the Torah mean? Torah means from your brother as opposed to your first cousin, that's okay? No, what it means is don't take ribbis from a yid. Why? Because we're all brothers. We're mamish brothers? No, not literally, figuratively. In fact, the Rambam says, and then in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim, that why do you find that the Torah refers to Yidden as being brothers, quote unquote? The reason, says the Rambam, is because the Eibishter said, Bonim atam l'Hashem Elokeichem. What's the definition of a brother? Definition of a brother is you share a common parent. So if we're all bonim l'Hashem, so that means we all have the same parent, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So by definition, just the textbook legal definition of what a brother is, that would make us all brothers. Because bonim atam l'Hashem Elokeichem, we have the same tata, and if we have the same tata, then by definition, it makes us brothers. As they say in Rambam in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim. So it's in that vein that the Torah says, don't take ribbis and from a yid because he's a chicha. But the Torah doesn't mean a biological brother. The Torah means he's your brother. Why? Because because he's a yid. Al zen nemar, that he doesn't behave like a yid, and halach is not treated like a yid. That nemesis has to do with the machlokes Ramein Rabbi Yehuda, ben kach kurim banim, the Shuvas HaRashba, the Raman Hilchos Avelos, the Ein Kam. But the point is that the reason there's an idea of someone that's a woman and a meshumah not being a chicha, because a chicha doesn't mean biological brother. It means you're a yid, you're a member of the tribe. Well, guess what? You can lose that schus if you don't behave properly. And that's what Chazal meant when they said that a person is not bichlal a chicha. Oh, but when it says in Yevamos, ki yeshvu achim yachtav, what does it mean achim? Two Jews? No, achim means your biological brother. So if it means biological brother, was came around that he's a meshumah? Was came around that he's a chal Shabbos b'farhesya? The word ach is the same word, it's spelled the same, it's pronounced the same, the mikra and the Messiahs are the same, but it's not the same word. It means something completely different. Achicha in halacha means another yid. Al zen nemar, if you're not michal achicha, you can there. Oh, but when it comes to yibum ki yesh v'achim yachtav means your biological brothers. Like the Gemara says, it means you have the same father. That's what it means. So if it means your biological fathers, what's make the mark? You're telling to achicha and hilchas ribis, to achicha and hilchas yibum. You know, asks this kasha, everybody. Aber beroishim the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef, here in Even HaEzer, it's in Siman Kuf Nun Zayin. Listen to some of the sprach of the Beis Yosef. The yesh l'tmoya, al misha ola al daitei heter zeh, v'al mar Yehudoi goyim, shenichta b'shmoi, mishum de gemiri, and he says, I think the reason this mistake happened is because we have a tradition, the Ma'orei Nayim Hava, that Mar Yehudoi, who's the original goyin that this was attributed to, he was a Ma'orei Nayim. It was difficult for him to see. Ulefamim koisvin talmida b'shmoi, and sometimes his talmidim would write over Torah in his name, Mashloi olal daitei, and they would write things that he never had a havamina to say. So says the Beis Yosef, even though it's brought down in the name of Mar Yehudoi goyin, and Imam B'Amunah Shleim, he never said. But this is one of those things that were written by one of the Talmidim. So he said, I'm not even asking him, are you going? Because it's poshut me, he never said this. Al Talmidah v'koisvin ke yesh l'tmaya. Or he said, but the Talmud couldn't be azam or it's not possible. The Talmud must have also had a little shaykhis to learning. And not just that, Val Bal Ha'Itur shehetit divrayim. He said the Bal Ha'Itur, Echel in Arishonim. He quoted it, that's his lashon. Why wasn't he right of that? Imam should have been right of it. He should have chased him out of his medrash. See, Imam is trying to shtusim. It doesn't make any sense. How is it possible? The David Poshetu, she'ein ledvarim elu shoyrish va'anaf v'lo shum tzad smach klal. Azoy shteit in Beis Yosef. Uncharacteristic to the Beis Yosef. Very, very sharp. So the Beis Yosef says Poshet has no pshat, and the reason it has no pshat is we're mamish, we're being medama, two things that have no shaykhs to each other. We're taking Chazal's understanding of the word achicha when it's referring to another yid versus Chazal's understanding to the word achicha when we're talking about ki yesh v'achim yach. Stating that it's Yodua that the Avnei Malur, right here in Siman Kuf Nun Zayin, the Baal Tzois HaChoshen said a teretz nifla to say pshat in the Mordechai. And that is that what's the makar? That Achim has to be Achim in our We just learned the Gemara. The Gemara really brought two Makars. One Makar is Ki Yesh V'Achim Yachtav. What does the Yachtav mean? It means Miyuchadim B'Nachla. And additionally, the Gemara brought Gzeir Shava Achim. It's learned out from the Bnei Yaakov. But the Makar, or at least one of the two Makars that the Gemara brought to the halacha that Yibum is only by Achim in our is from the fact that it says Ki Yesh V'Achim Yachtav, and Achim Yachtav means Miyuchadim B'Nachla. So what does it mean Miyuchadim B'Nachla? So it says the Avnei Malur. You want to know what Miyuchadim B'Nachla means? What it means is, quote, it's referring to two brothers that are Ru'uyin Leiresh Zeh. That's number one. And number two, Sheyorshin Nachla Achas. That's the way the Avnei Malur quotes Rashi. Sheyorshin Nachla Achas, Sheyorshin Zeh. Says, you know what the definition of Achim is? Achim and Av, right? Of course. Why Achim and Av? Because they have to be brothers in Yerusha. What does it mean they have to be brothers in Yerusha? Number one, they both yarshin their father. The father dies, the sons are getting yarshin. And number two, they're yarshin zeh, they yarshin each other. So the halacha is that if a man dies and he leaves over a son, and the son is a meshumid, he's a mumma l'kol ha'torah kula, the halacha is that the son does not yarshin his father. It's halacha. He doesn't yarshin his father. He's mufka from the halacha of nachlos. So it's pashit. That's what the Goyim meant. What they meant is that being that you find as a concept that a mummer can lose his status as a yid, and one of the places you find it lemaisa is in Hilchas Nachlos, and the definition of an ach in Yibum is based on Hilchas Nachlos. Because Kiyesh v'achim yachta v'achim and av. Why? Because they're ru'in leirish sheyorshin nachla achas v'yorshin zeh. So being that it's based on Dina Yerusha, that's the whole makar, that's the whole origin to this concept. So if that's the case, if you would have a man that would die, or that would leave over a child that's a mummer, being that he wouldn't yarshin his father, so it comes out that him and his brother are not brothers in Yibum. He said that's pshat in the Goinim. The Goinim held that if Reuben and Shimon are achim, and one of them is a mummer, it doesn't matter which one. The halacha is that there won't be Yibum. Why? Because even though they're brothers, but at the same time, they're brothers that aren't subject to Dina Yerusha together. And because they're not subject to Dina Yerusha together, they're as if they would have been Achim and No'im. Because what's the makar that Achim and No'im are not considered Achim? It's based on the fact that it says Ki Yesh v'Achim Yachtov. And Ki Yesh v'Achim Yachtov means that it has to be Miyuchad Menachlo. And what's Miyuchad Menachlo? Sheyorshin Nachla Achas v'Yorshin Zeh. So that's the case. If you would have now two brothers that are not able to yarshin together, so therefore they're not any better than Achim and No'im. So Zochta Abnei Malon, being that a woman doesn't yarshin, so it comes out that even if he's Achim and Av together with his brother, but he's not really Achim and Av, and if he's not really Achim and Av, it's for that reason he's not going to be able to do Yibum, and that's the pshat in the Goinim when they said that, because he's a mummer, he doesn't have a din of a yid. They didn't mean because it says Achim. They meant because Achim by Yibum is totally Nachlo, and Azaz Sar Bruda doesn't have a din Nachlo, and because he doesn't have a din Nachlo, it's for that reason he's going to be Mufta. Ad kan Devreim HaMefursamim Shala Avnei Malon. But the emes is, it's Yodua that Chassam Sofer and others will matmi on this Avnei Malon. Chassam Sofer is in Shailas HaTshuvas Chassam Sofer. It's in Evin Ezer Beis. It's Siman Ayin Dalet. He said it's a beautiful shtickle Torah from the Avnei Malon. There's one problem. The Avnei Malon didn't have the same Rashi apparently that we had. We read the Rashi 3 times on purpose when we went through the Gemara. What did the Gemara say? Now, what's the definition of miyuchadim benachla haru'uyin leiresh zeh? Miyuchadim benachla means they're able to yarshin each other. When the Avnei Malon quoted Rashi, this is the way he quoted it. He said, "What does it mean? Miyuchadim benachla sheyarshin nachla achas v'yarshin zeh. They yarshin one nachla and they yarshin each other." Now, the way the Avnei Malon has Rashi's girsa, it's very good. It's a very nice Torah. It's because they have to be Yerush Nachla Achas. A ben that's a woman doesn't yarshin his father. As a result, they're not Yerush Nachla Achas, these two brothers. So they're not any better than Achim and Oim. And that's Pshad in the Goinim that said that if there's a woman, there's not going to be any Dina Yib. The problem is it's not what Rashi says. What Rashi says is Miyuchadim and Nachla means Haru'uyim Leirej Zeh. Leirej Zeh. If you have two brothers and one of them is a mummer, the halach is the mummer, in theory, would be able to yarshin his brother. We have no makar anywhere that he can't. And if we have no makar anywhere that he can, so mehechatesa he can. So we have to assume he could. And if he could, so then if you have two brothers where one of them is a mummer, even though it's true they wouldn't be able to yarshin their father together, or yarshin zeh mehechatesa not. And if that's the case, is l'chayra is arop to Avnei Malon's teretz. So the Chassam Sofer says the mechilas kvay teirasa shel Avnei Malon. He had a girsa in a Rashi that I've never seen. I've never seen such a girsa. None of the Rishon. No one brings such a girsa in Rashi. So if no one brings such a girsa in Rashi, it's a pella where the Avnei Malon even got this girsa from. And the problem is the whole shtickle Torah of the Avnei Malon is based on a girsa that we don't have. So it's based on a girsa we don't have. L'chayra it's arop to teretz. But the emes is that if you look on the bottom of the Avnei Malon from Reb Jimmy Trofsky, so he brings that the emes is that even if we'll assume that the Avnei Malon maybe didn't have the gersa that he quoted, but at the same time there's a pshat in this Avnei Malon, and the emes is the Avnei Malon is l'shitasai to what he wrote in Ktsois HaChoshen and Siman Reish Nun Gimel, because the truth is that there's a big discussion in the Achronim exactly how two brothers yarshin each other. So there's a whole seder of nachlas, right? A man dies, his children yarshin, the meloi ben, bas, father, mother, right? There's a whole seder of how Yerusha happens. At some point, brothers could yarshin, but there's a shaila how it works. Does it work direct? A brother actually has a schus to yarshin his brother. So da andere uberoishim because I sachoishin and reishon gimel and Reb Kiveger and Shuvas kuflam and beis. That's it's not the way it works. But rather it works with what's known as mishmush. What happens is the father yarshins bekever, and then the son yarshins from his father. So it ends up in the same. It's just semantics, right? Just the lawyers have to figure out how to paper this. But lemaisa, you want to know how it works? It doesn't work that Reuben and Shimon are yarshining each other directly. Reuven dies, Yaakov is going to yarshin Reuven, and then Shimon is going to but Yaakov's not alive. There's a concept, he can be Yerush Bekever. It's what's known as the idea of Mishmush. But the bottom line is that's what's going to happen. What's going to happen is the Yerush is going to happen by day Mishmush. It's Zok of Jimmy Trovsky that it's the Abinul L'Shitosai. The Abinul who said in Simen Reish Nun Gimel, that how does Yerushas Ha'achim work? It works al Yidei Mishmush. The way the Yerusha works is it works through the brothers, it works through the father. So if it works through the father, then when Rashi says they have to be Ruyim Leiresh Zeh, that by definition it means they have to be Ruyim to Yarshin their father. Because if they can't Yarshin their father, if the relationship, the yachas between the son and the father is upgahak, so that means there's no way for them to yashin each other either. And if there's no way for them to yashin each other, so there's a chsar in kiyeshvu achim yachtav, they're not yuchadim benachla. If they're not yuchadim benachla, then no better than achim and oem. It's just like achim and oem are excluded from the halachas of Yibum, so it's in that same vein they would be excluded from the halachas of Yibum as well. This is the teretz from the Abnei Milum to explain the Shitas HaGoyim. But the bottom line is, you can see the Beis Yosef was matmiya on the Shitas HaGoyim. Yosef really didn't like the shita. I mean, the lashonis that he uses, right? The davar posheru she'en ledvarim elu shoyrish la'anaf v'lo shum tzad smach. There's absolutely no tzad in the world to be soymech on this shita zagayinim. And the Yosef l'shitasa, when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch in his mechaber and Siman Kufnu and Zion, he does not bring the shita zagayinim. Fakir, he paskins that doesn't matter if the brother that died is a mummer or if the brother that's alive is a mummer, and even the Ramah goes together with the Mechaber, and he says that a mummer is subject to the laws of Yibum, just like any brother is subject. He has one kula that in the event that the Yevamos got married already, and then afterwards she found out that there was a brother, and the brother happened to have been a mummer, so there the Ramah says, B'di'evid mamish, she could be soymech on this Shitas HaGoyim. So it's a fascinating thing, because this is the Shitas HaGoyim, right? We talk about Yeridas HaDoros, Goyim are kamat like Amiran, and this is a Shitas HaGoyim, and many Goyim said this. Abu Maisa, ein l'dayin elamasha ein avroyas, and the Achronim really didn't understand the Shitas HaGoyim, and you see the Beis Yosef thought it was a toys, thought it was a mistake. And if it's a mistake, the Goyim didn't say it. If they said it, that's one thing. But if it's a mistake, they didn't say it. And Lamaisa, all the poskim said not that way. We're not going to talk about this now. It got late early. But the emes is that there are many fascinating truths that were written over the years where this was something that played out. Because the emes is, you can a woman that falls liyibum, if there's a brother that is not going to be miyabimer, obviously, and also doesn't want to do chalitza for whatever reason, this woman can end up in aguna. It can end up being a very big problem. And the truth is, in general, if you look at tshuvas from the Gedolei Achronim, the Yehuda, the Chasam, all the Gedolei Achronim, in their tshuvas in Even Ezer, there was a lot of Yevamos shaylas. Right? Today it's much less shchiach, but once upon a time there were real tshuvas that were written b'negei Yevamos, and very often it was dealing with a situation where you had a woman, she's a Yevamos, she's on one side of the world, and her husband died with no children. There's a brother that's living on the other side of the world, so go find them now. And what happens if, like in our case, he's a woman, he doesn't want to do chalitza. So you'd be very incentivized to be soymech on the Shitas HaGoyim. Mishum aguna akilu be'rabbanim. Befrad you have a Shitas HaGoyim. But you see, the Achronim were very hesitant to ever be soymech on this Shitas HaGoyim, leaving a fascinating truth from the Reid Bite on the table. That's Hashem will pick it up in the coming days.